that Jesus himself walks up to you and says, you're going to write the next New York Times bestseller. What would you say? How excited would you be? Imagine that Jesus himself comes to you and says you're going to stand on a stage, and that message that I have planted deeply in your heart, you are going to speak that message to thousands upon thousands of women. I would just twirl in my living room if I heard those words. Imagine that he says to you, that unique, creative DNA that I've put inside of you, that entrepreneurial spirit that is deep in your bones that I put there, you're going to start a nonprofit, and it's going to lift women out of oppression. How excited would we be? But then he adds one caveat. That New York Times bestseller, your name is not going to be on the cover. That stage, you're going to be in the shadows, in obscurity. And in fact, the spotlight is going to shine on someone else. And that nonprofit, the one you've wept over, the one you've invested your family's finances in, the one that you have worked untold hours, no one's going to know it's you. There's going to be no applause, no press releases, no affirmation, no acclaim. Are you still excited? Do you still show up? Are you still twirling in your living room? And if not, why not? That leads us to a harder question, ladies. And after 20 years of being in ministry, 18 writing, 8 of them speaking, 4 in obedience, 4 years in joy. It's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. But it leads to a harder question. If this is about him, why would it matter if our name is on it or not? I've been in the book of Luke for a little while. I woke up one night wrestling in my faith. I fell in love with Jesus as a teenager, not knowing that he even existed, and it flipped my world upside down. I went home into a home of chaos, but something in my heart had begun to change. I started in ministry because I couldn't help but tell others that he was real, and I wanted to draw them to him. But can we be honest with one another? Sometimes our faith, but specifically tonight, I want to talk about ministry. Sometimes our faith and our ministry can morph and get tangled and twisted and go down really different paths than where we began. And it can get really complicated. Have you ever been there? Are you there now? I wanted a fresh start. I wanted to go into one of the Gospels, and I just happened to choose Luke because that's where my Bible opened to. And I wanted to walk with the disciples, and I wanted to hear Jesus as if I were hearing the words for the very first time. I wanted to watch his example. I knew that these men had no idea what saying yes to Jesus was going to mean in their life. They had no idea where it would take them. All they knew is he had extended an invitation of come with me. And I wanted to stand, and this is going to sound a little out there, but as if I were the 13th disciple, because I am a modern day disciple as you are. And I wanted to just walk and listen and hear and then turn around and put it into my everyday life and see if it might change me, if it might remind me of how much I loved ministry and how much I loved God. I want to start tonight in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 19, because this is where these early followers were chosen. I'm reading from the New Living Translation. One day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples, and he chose 12 of them to be apostles. I want to stop just for a moment. Not unlike today, if you were of some notoriety, if you had some fame, if you were a great teacher, you had followers, people who watched you and listened to you. And in this crowd, in these followers, some are curious. Some are already devoted. Some follow him to make trouble for him because he is getting in the way of how things have always been done. I also noted that Jesus prayed all night, and isn't that intriguing? He is God. And yet, he went alone, and this teaches me more than I can even describe. He went alone when making this huge decision, and he sought the counsel of his heavenly Father all night long. Here are their names: Simon, whom he named Peter; Andrew, Peter's brother; James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus; Simon, who was called the Zealot; Judas, son of James; Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. When they came down from the mountain, the disciples stood with Jesus on a large level area, surrounded by many of his followers and by the crowds. There were people from all over Judea and from Jerusalem and from as far north as the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon. They had come to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. And those troubled by evil spirits were healed. The newly appointed disciples stood shoulder to shoulder with each other and shoulder to shoulder with Jesus. They had just been chosen. And as they looked out across the crowd, what did they see? The need in front of them. Those who were troubled, those who had come from long distances, hoping upon hope that Jesus had something for them because they couldn't find it themselves. This is where the real work began. Because Jesus began to mentor and teach, and here I am, the 13th disciple, just following along behind them on the fringe, learning. Jesus taught the disciples how to pray because there was a need. He showed them the power of putting your hands on someone and believing big when you feel small. He showed them that prayer is always acceptable. He showed them that prayer is powerful and effective. He showed them how to mentor and disciple others because, see, there were 12 and Jesus, but there was a need. And so it was very, very important that they poured in and mentored and taught others. It was very important as he spoke to them, sometimes in rebuke, beautiful, compassionate, life-changing rebuke. Sometimes in encouragement. You got it, guys. You feed them. Why? Because there was a need. He showed them how to deal with difficult people. He showed them when they were being the difficult people. He showed them how to love people. And this is really key. He showed them how to keep going when people weren't ready to hear what they had to say. Because around the corner and in the next city and across the world, there was a need. I loved this one. He showed them how to fill back up when they were empty. I often come to the end of myself. Do you? Jesus would show them that when we pour out and we pour out and we pour out and we pour out, that if we don't take time to stop and fill back up and fill back up and fill back up, all that we're giving them is the dried, hard, crusty salt left in the bottom of a salt shaker. We have lost our tang. We are not effective. And sometimes these guys, because they signed up for this not knowing where it was going to take them, they would say to Jesus, hey, I just want a little spotlight. Just a little spotlight. And Jesus would do something like pull a child to stand beside them and remind them that the kingdom is made up of the least of these. Why? Because of the need. There's one question I think it's important that we ask, because we have filled up this weekend with resources, with information, with connection, with community, and it's beautiful. But I need to ask myself this question as I leave the doors of this hotel. Is my need to be known greater than the need before me? Is our need to be known greater than the need before us? I look at James, the son of Alphaeus. Here's a man that was chosen. Jesus called out his name clearly. And yet, after that moment where he's chosen in Luke chapter 6, he kind of disappears. He's back row, out of sight. He's vaguely mentioned in 2 Corinthians by Paul. I had to dig really deep to make sure it was him. He's briefly mentioned in Acts. When they say the disciples, he's always in that group. But listen, some of these guys, James and John and Peter, they hogged the spotlight, didn't they? And so I began to just really study James, the son of Alphaeus, and I found another name for him in history, James the Lesser. How fun would that be? Lesser is micros. Micros means short. So he was James, the guy who was shorter than the other guy named James. There are two things that can happen in ministry, ladies. We can misplace our joy. We can start to look at something like unique hits. We can start to think we're not recognized enough. We can start to compare. We can work hard and feel like we're not getting enough of something, and we misplace our joy. But we can also have misplaced joy. And I want to hang there just for a moment. Misplaced joy happens when our identity becomes tied to what we do or what people say about us. Because see, there's going to be seasons when that book contract does come, that bestseller does come. And I want to say this very clearly. If you're praying for a New York Times bestseller, please understand that there are things that come with that. You are suddenly exposed to a world who looks at you under a microscope, and your family under a microscope, and your ministry under a microscope. Be careful what you pray for. But suddenly you're in this place where you do have that bestseller. You are speaking to thousands of women. That nonprofit is taking off. There are people walking down the hall calling out your name. They want to take selfies with you. We can have misplaced joy when our identity becomes tied to that, because ministry seasons shift. There are times when the Lord asks you to put down what you love so he can fill you back up. Do you know how much joy I'm finding today in speaking to you? I stepped off the Proverbs 31 Ministries team 6 months ago out of obedience. I mourned it. I mourned it. It felt like a loss. And yet I knew it's where God had me because I was at the bottom of empty. And I needed margin, and I wanted all my old words to go away so that the Lord could give me new ones. It took me about 2 weekends to realize that this was a pretty awesome thing. But when I was making that decision, before I made the phone call, I remember the accuser just speaking into my ears saying, "Do you know how many people would want that spot?" And I thought, if I'm holding it so tightly that the Lord himself says, put it down, and I hold on, it's not about him. It's about me. So I joyfully opened my hands and said, Lord, you know what I need. There are seasons when he asks you to put down what you love so he can fill you back up. Or maybe he puts the spotlight on someone else because there's a specific need that they can feel that maybe you can't. Or maybe they're just the right person for the job at that moment. And we can become like a bungee cord with misplaced joy. Oh, I had 100,000 hits this month. Woo, I'm awesome. I'm up. Oh, nobody commented on my blog. I'm down. I'm low. Oh, my book, I got a contract. I'm up. Oh, it didn't sell very many copies. I'm low. So where do we find our joy? How do we avoid living in misplaced joy? Our true joy comes from the fact that we're chosen. Our true joy comes from the fact that we're chosen back row, front row, spotlight, out of sight. Every person hearing this message has been chosen if you call yourself a follower of Christ. And when we begin to place our joy in the fact that we have been chosen, we get to do this. We get to. When we begin to place our joy in the fact that we have been chosen to partner with God's heart in ministry, we're grounded. There's no more bungee cord. I thought I would be in the book of Luke for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 years. 2 years. I hung out with those disciples, sometimes in passages for days and days and days, just trying to see and understand. It eventually became a book called Come With Me that just came out. But it's not a book for me. I get to walk with Jesus every single day. It's not a book for me. It will never be a book for me. It became this beautiful place where I exchanged wrestling with God to resting in God. I began to ask the Lord in my prayer time, after I exchanged wrestling with God to resting in God, instead of saying, Lord, bless this book that I've labored on and gave birth to, and please, Lord, get it into bookstores. Listen, I worked hard. I continue to work hard. I will always work hard with books or blogging or speaking or ministry or whatever it is that God allows me to do. But my prayers changed from, Lord, bless the efforts that I've done, to one question that I ask every single day. I asked it this morning, and I'll ask it tomorrow morning. What can I do, Lord, to bring you joy today? What can I do to bring you joy today? The answers were surprises. surprising. Sometimes it came in the smallest of moments. I would be holding Josiah, my 2-year-old grandson, while his mom took a mini break from boys that have energy that are like tsunami-sized. And I'm holding Josiah in my arms while Melissa is taking a little nap, and his eyes are heavy. And I'm singing a really silly song over him while he's snuggled in my arms. Went to the animal fair. The birds and the bees were there. The big baboon by the light of the moon was sitting in his underwear. And I heard the Lord in that moment say, Suzie, this brings me joy. I wish I could tell you why. Maybe it's because my daughter just needed a rest. Maybe there was something happening in the emotional DNA of this beautiful little man in my arms that only God could see. Because see, I can only see the external, but God always sees the eternal impact of what we do. But then there's other times that were much larger, much more challenging, like the time I went to India. It was March of this year, and my friend Amy Carroll sent me a message, and we're on the international initiative team under the umbrella of Proverbs, and she said, Suzie, it appears that we're going to get to go with Mission India to do this. The pieces are falling into place. Do you have your passport? And I had thought that this was going to happen like really late 2016 or maybe even early 2017. And yet the pieces were falling in place. And so I literally picked up my Mac and looked at my Google Calendar. And I thought, September's good. August is great. July's a little iffy. June, Then I looked at April and May, and I kind of laughed at myself because I thought there's no way that a trip with 12 planes in 9 days, partnering with Mission India, a video team, people from the Proverbs team, there's no way that that could come together that quickly. But Lord, just in case, look at all those red and yellow and green lines on that calendar. You see, in the end of April, I was hosting a retreat, or the middle of April. I was hosting a Come With Me retreat and launch, and women were flying in from all over the nation to Northwest Arkansas to hang out with me. I was under a book deadline for a different book that was due the first week in May. I had a book coming out the first week of May. And so I kind of just like showed my calendar to the Lord as if he didn't know what my life is about. And I was like, anything but the last 2 weeks of April or the first week of May. 1 week later, I received a text, and I know you know what it said. Suzie, we have honed in on the exact time that we're going to be going. It's somewhere in the last 2 weeks of April or the first week of May. And I literally had my hands on my phone ready to text back to say something like this, man, I want to go, but I just can't. This is going to open the door for someone else. Isn't that cool? And my heart was heavy because my heart is international missions. And then the Lord spoke to me as clear as if he were sitting across from me. It was deep inside of me, and it said this: are you more concerned with launching a book about following where I lead? Over actually following where I lead? Needless to say, I sent a quick text, said 2 words: I'm in. I'm in. We landed in India. It was 111 degrees on the best of days. It got to 118 in some of the areas. We went with Mission India to these different beautiful literacy programs that lifted women who had never had access to education, and it was teaching them how to read. We prayed with women who had been beaten because through that program they had become believers. We didn't sleep a lot some nights. We went for long days. And there were days, and I'm just going to be honest with you, and I have went on many trips. But there were days when I would stand in a rag-picking slum and see an 18-month-old little girl with a jagged cut on her ankle, no diaper. And it was overwhelming. And I knew I was supposed to be there, but it felt so big. And I felt so small. And I just prayed. One night, Lynn, Cal, and I went to a late night literacy program, and it was about 110 degrees. And we had had the opportunity to pray with women to see the beauty of this work being done and the partnership between Lysa and her book Uninvited and this beautiful work of Mission India. And it was late, and we started to get in the car, and Josh, who was with Mission India, leaned over and he said, I hate to ask this. I know it's late, but on the other side of a city, my friend, his wife has cancer. And Suzie, aren't you a breast cancer survivor? And I am. And he said, she's low, she's down, and she's a believer. And I just wonder, could we go and pray with her? The reason he hesitated is because I don't know if you've ever traveled to India, but imagine a giant snarling game of chicken. That's the traffic. There were whole families on scooters with a baby hanging over an arm. There were lanes that should be going this way, and we were going that way, but there were also cars coming this way. And even though it was late at night, because India never sleeps, the traffic was atrocious. And Josh said, we're going to have to go all the way across the city. And that's going to take somewhere around 45 minutes. And then we have to go all the way back. And I just hate to ask you this, but Lynn and I both were like, no, we'd love to go. We ended up at the apartment. We walked in, and I sat next to Caroline. Lynn sat on another side, and the other team members came in and sat down. And I began to talk with Caroline and just encourage her. She had just come from the hospital. She had just had her chemo. She was sitting in her clothes. And you can certainly tell we had been in 111-degree heat all day long. That we sat with her and began to talk with her. And I noticed that she was staring at me, like intently staring at me, like... And I didn't know, it was hot. I didn't know if there was something on my face but suddenly she put her hand on my face and she said these words, are you Suzie Eller? What? What? Are you Suzie Eller? I said, yes. How did you know that? You didn't expect us. We weren't supposed to be here. You didn't know what we're doing. You don't know me. What? She said, I received the Proverbs 31 devotions. And every day, those devotions encourage me in my faith. India is a secular democratic nation, but let me tell you, there is overt and subtle persecution that is great. By calling herself a believer, she opens herself up to isolation. She opens herself up to persecution. I asked a really dumb question in India. I said, how do you deal with persecution? And I had this look as someone said to me, can you have Christianity without persecution? Not in India. And Caroline said, she said, Suzie. And then she looked over at Lynn and she said, you're Lynn Cal. And she started naming names of those who wrote devotions, and she said, every single morning I read the devotions, and it's like I'm sitting with friends as we talk about Jesus. And I have often prayed that I could go to the U.S. and tell you thank you for being my friends and encouraging me in my faith. But in my lowest hour, God himself brought you to my front door. Lynn and I got in the car afterwards, and we said, did that just happen? That was a 1 in 1.2 billion encounter. It was not on the agenda. We were not in the part of the city that we were supposed to be in. We didn't know her, but she knew us. And suddenly I realized, as I look back to that moment where I was holding up my calendar with its red and yellow and blue and purple stripes, that this was never about me. God saw her need. She was on his heart. And the fact that I had breast cancer 25 years earlier as a young mama, somehow he took that really hard season of my life and used it to good. As he compelled me to come to India so Josh would say, hey, you've had breast cancer, right? Let's go. Our need to be known pales in comparison to the need before us. I hope that your book sells. I pray that there are bestsellers in this room. I pray that your blog flourishes and explodes. I pray that you get to speak. I pray that your nonprofit lifts women out of oppression, because over 50% of women in the world are in oppression. I pray this because right now, nearly 7,000 unreached people groups in the world have never heard the name of Jesus. Tonight, when I began, I shared what I considered an exciting invitation. Can I share with you the most powerful invitation that any of us have ever received? The only one that matters. What if Jesus came to you? And he does. And he said, come with me, sister. Wherever I lead you, whatever I ask of you, whatever price I ask you to pay, whatever miracle I want to do in you, or whatever miracle I want to do through you. That's our invitation. So front row, back row, spotlight, out of sight, we have been chosen to partner with Jesus, with the needs that are upon his heart. Will you say yes?